I have often said that should anyone attack South Africa, it would be the easiest and quickest war in the history of the world. Basically, all you would have to do is walk onto the beach, plant your flag, and most of South Africa would just go, oh, okay, never mind then. Well, I guess we'll just go with you. Our military is completely bust, right? Our economy is completely bust. In fact, I think most South Africans would welcome anyone else that would like to take a crack at ruling and running this country. But things get so much worse, so much worse when you realize that the very company that is supposed to build the sort of military structures and the military vehicles that should keep our country safe and should form sort of like the first bulwark against any sort of foreign invasion, Denel is in serious trouble. Not only is Denel on the verge of bankruptcy and has been for about 5 years now, right? So 5 years ago, it was on the edge of bankruptcy, and that has not gotten any better. But the other problem with Denel is that the company has lost dozens of staff to companies abroad as it's facing financial challenges, put it on the edge of bankruptcy 5 years ago. But Minister of Defense Angie Motshekga, who literally doesn't know shit about anything, and CEO Tshepo Monaheng told Parliament's Joint Standing Committee on Defence on Friday that the company still holds great potential for skills development and to be a leader in its field, but it doesn't.
How dare you?
Because fundamentally, South Africa has some of the most bonkers race-based laws in the history of the world. Now, I want to be super clear. When I read through this article, which was absolutely fantastic, The Decline of South Africa's Defence Industry, which is all about Denel, by the way, and Denel used to be one of the largest and most advanced military sort of complexes in the world. If you go through the article, the AI sort of sums it up really, really well. Denel was highly capable and innovative as a defense company. You can go through all of this on your own if you want to. Literally just search how good was Denel in 1980s, and you'll find this article popping up. Read through it, and you'll see the incredible rise that started in a very short period of time. So it really kicked off in 1984 when the UN arms embargo happened, where South Africa was no longer allowed to buy arms from any United Nations country, or at least any United Nations linked country. This also, by the way, should explain to you why the ANC hates Israel as much as they do, because Israel was one of the few countries who continued to supply arms to the South African government to fight the communist regimes trying to push into the rest of Africa. But fundamentally, Denel today is no longer the Denel of the past. And this article goes through all of the reasons for it, from a shift away from caring so much about defense and more caring about security to ultimately just corruption kind of bleeding the company dry. And now you have this skills shortage that has hit Denel. And you might ask, but why? Stefan, like, why is there a skills shortage? It's not like we have a limited supply of engineers. It's not like we have a limited supply of scientists. South Africans are incredibly good at all of those things. We have phenomenal engineers, as is seen by every other country wanting our scientists, wanting our engineers, and the company itself being blade dry by its own employees going abroad. So what exactly is the problem? For that, we have to go and look deeper. Specifically, we have to go look at BEE and the race-based hiring practices of South Africa. We're going to listen to Gerard Papenvos, which is probably the most Afrikaans name you'll ever hear in your entire life. Gerard Papenvos is the CEO of the National Employers Association of South Africa, and he explains white economic exclusion. Just listen to this, and then we're going to listen to another video that puts even more context to this.
I want to explain to you black employment equity, the transformation, affirmative action process in 1 minute. Is this. In this scheme, there are two classes of people. Mm-hmm. The one is a designated group, and the other one is a non-designated group. Let me tell you who's the designated group. The designated group consists out of black people. And black people, the term black people consists out of three things: Africans, men and women; colored people, men and women; Indian people, men and women; and then white women, and then people with disabilities.
Yeah.
That covers the whole of the South African population. That's the designated group. This group is the advantaged group.
You'll note that there's a group missing from this, right? White men. You see, in the non-designated group, in other words, the group that has no employment protections in South Africa, is white men. All other groups are well protected within South Africa, although it should be mentioned that these protected groups also come with hierarchies. So, for example, black women is the most protected group in South Africa, then black men, then it would be colored women, then colored men, then Indian women, Indian men. Although above colored would also be Chinese people. So, Chinese people are shoehorned into almost on par with black people under the BEE and employment equity. This is thanks to sort of deals between China and South Africa. And then finally, right at the bottom, you would have white women who would then also be protected, but not as protected as any of the other groups, right? And then white men, no protections whatsoever. Now, historically, this has been the case, and this is how it's worked in South Africa for a very long time. Fundamentally, what this did was it forced a lot of white people, specifically white men, because they could not find jobs in the sort of established economy, they were forced to go into entrepreneurship. They would have to start their own businesses because, well, what else are you supposed to do? And this led to a number of South African businessmen starting to make a lot of money, right? They became very rich because they built companies that people wanted. And what the South African government needed to do was to educate black people, educate colored people, to the point where they too could start sort of working within the economy. Because, sometimes it just takes generations to fix problems. White people come from a background where I remember from as young as I can remember, actually, I was taught to work hard, to study hard, to focus on my schoolwork, to think critically about things around me, to think with a business mindset about the world and to think about what contributions I can make to society in order to extract value from those contributions. These are all things that come as a result of education, right? You don't get these things by just being employed. You don't get this by just putting someone in a position where they can find, a job. It has to come with education. The government didn't want to wait for an education revolution to happen. And so instead, it just sort of passed these laws that said, no, you're not going to hire white men, you're going to hire everyone else. And then white men became very, very rich. Well, you'll find out how in 2025, that has also now been changed completely. In this video it's explained, it is the new South African race-based hiring quotas explained in 5 minutes, and this is by Sakelige.
Employment equity in South Africa dates back more than 3 decades. In the years running up to 1994, apartheid racial policies are eliminated.
And I just want to make this super clear. No one is denying that there were really bad stuff happening in 1994 prior to 1994, right? No one is denying that apartheid was a really, really terrible and bad system. The point that everyone is trying to make is that all of the reasons why the South African economy ultimately ended up faltering and ultimately ended up failing, because the South African government, much like the national government, I should say, because the National Party was in charge at the time, much like the ANC today, they weren't sort of benefiting all white people. They were only benefiting those who were connected. I myself, my grandfather had to leave school at the age of, I think, 12. But he couldn't even finish primary school because his parents ran out of money. My grandmother also couldn't finish primary school because her parents ran out of money. She was forced to go back and work in order to support the household. My grandfather worked as a bricklayer, bought his first farm in his 30s, managed to turn that farm into 3 other farms, then almost lost those farms, and the government didn't come to his aid. At the age of 50, my grandfather was forced to go back to bricklaying because droughts hit and the farms were starting to crumble. So most white people were not being benefited by the South African government, but my grandfather and grandmother had one fundamental role and goal, and that was all of their children will be educated. They worked their asses off to make sure that my father and all of his siblings went to school, finished school, went to university, finished university, and fundamentally got their degrees. And of course, that was passed on to me, and I hope to pass that on to my children one day. But these are things that happen generationally. But now the South African government just decides in 1994 to start bringing back all of the things that were crumbling the South African economy outside of just the sanctions. The sanctions were bad, but a big part of why the South African national government was failing at the time was because of nepotism and corruption that was starting to crumble and sort of hoodwink the South African economy.
But later that year, the new government reintroduces race-based hiring for state employees. Now, the first major escalation comes in 1998 with the introduction of the Employment Equity Act. It extends race-based employment requirements to all public and now private organizations with 50 or more staff. The Act demands that employers hire based on race and gender to make all organizations reflect national demographics.
See, this is already a problem because you have a large chunk of the population, around 80% of the population, who have no education or very limited education. So if you start demanding that all companies must reflect this, so all companies must be 80% black, you're going to start running into problems where you're going to have to employ people who just aren't that good because they have no education. And contrary to what many people would like to think, anyone that actually has a job that they studied for will know that a layman off the street isn't just going to walk in and do that job, right? There's a lot that goes into it. So what oftentimes happened and what a lot of businesses in South Africa would do is they would hire shadow employees effectively because they needed to hit these quotas. What they would do is they would literally go to a bunch of black people that aren't educated, hire them for sometimes reduced salaries. But the reason they were doing this was because they didn't need these people to work there. They just needed these people so that they could hire actual people to do the jobs. And these people were happy because they were getting funds for doing nothing effectively. And this would allow these companies to operate. But as you can imagine, this becomes highly inefficient because companies are ballooning. And in South Africa, getting rid of workers is harder than actually getting workers. So, it's a mess that happened. And it starts to explain why we're in this position right now.
In state employment, these demands are blindly implemented and public administration enters rapid decline.
Yep.
But the vagueness of the requirements still enable employers to find ways around this racial engineering, mitigating damage and protecting their workplaces from forced discrimination.
Yeah, as I just explained to you.
Then in 2025, dissatisfied that employers still find ways to exercise autonomy.
Here's the big moment. Here's where everything started to change and where I believe you will now see South Africa enter a new era of rapid decline.
Autonomy and hiring, the government introduces the most extreme employment regulations to date. The latest employment equity regulations for the first time establish explicit employment quotas.
Yep.
Employers are classified into 18 industries, each split into 4 employment tiers. Each of these 72 categories is then assigned specific quotas for race, gender, and disability.
Now think about this, right? So now employers, and this, by the way, no longer just stems to or pertains to companies that want to do business with the government. This now pertains to all businesses. So even if you're a white man in South Africa that starts your own business and this business grows to a specific level, you will have the government come in and tell you, right, change your demographics to reflect that of the countries immediately. So if you have 10 white people working for you and 20 black people working for you, you're going to have to get rid of a bunch of white people or hire more black people. Even if you don't necessarily need more of those black people, you're going to have to hire them. But then it gets even worse because now it's also gender-based, right? So if they tell you you need 50% women working in your company, if you're an engineering firm, most women don't go into engineering, yet you're going to be forced to find like 50% of your company as females or force a bunch of the men to become women. And then you're also going to have to get disabilities, but then you could also get those men that just became women to classify them as disabled because they're retarded. And that should get you to that level. So there are ways around this, but it is going to be somewhat challenging.
From September 2025, employers have 5 years to fully comply, but risk fines every year for slow progress.
See, this is the nightmare, ladies and gentlemen, and this is why companies like Denel is in trouble. This is why we in South Africa are in trouble. Because fundamentally, there is no way to save this. There's no way to combat this. Companies like Denel, government SOEs, state owned enterprises, are all going the way of the dodo bird. And instead of allowing them to die like they should be, the government continues to prop them up with taxpayer money. We're continuing to see massive expenditure across the board. We're seeing massive, I just covered this in a story earlier today, but we're seeing massive, massive corruption and fraud happening on a national level. We're seeing companies like this engaged in basically stealing from the South African people. The government spending 97,000 Rand per toilet. Everything is going downhill, and it all comes to a head in this. The South African economy is crumbling, and the South African government is trying its absolute best to speed up that process. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, let me know in the comment section down below how you feel living in South Africa. Are you super excited, happy about it? Let me know. As always, hit the like if you liked it, if you didn't. And I will see all of you in the next one. Peace.